the recording. And Drake, whenever you're ready.
Okay, well, welcome everyone, and glad you are back with us for the 5th edition of the Zoom Covenant class. Bruce Miller is with us again today to lead us in a discussion on Bible passages we tend to forget, but maybe why we shouldn't. A few quick announcements before we get to Bruce. The 21 days of prayer session starts tomorrow, October 5th. The final gift, Dying Well 4-week workshop begins on October 6th. And please remember, if you're interested, to order your meals by Journey Kitchen, which you can do online and then pick up at the church. In terms of our Zoom format for the class, please remember that you can come as you are, because nobody can see or hear you on the classes. We will be pausing periodically for questions. So if you have any, please type them into the Q&A function in Zoom. Also, please remember that all classes are recorded. So if you miss any or would like to watch them again, you can do so through the link that will be sent out following the class. We welcome any suggestions on how to improve the class. So please feel free to email myself, Mary D. or Wilson, if you have any suggestions. Please keep in your thoughts and prayers those in the military and those on the special concerns list. And if you have any other announcements, joys, or concerns, please feel free to type them into the chat function in Zoom. And Wilson, I believe you had a few announcements from staff.
Yeah, morning, everybody. Couple things on our end. First, remember, in worship today, we are celebrating the sacrament of communion. So in between covenant class and worship, you may want to gather your communion elements if you've not already planned to do so or have done so already. So that is happening today in worship. Also, tonight is our first Diving Deeper conversation group where we're going to be talking about and using the book, I Think You're Wrong, But I'm Listening, a guide to grace-filled political conversations, as our guide for beginning to have some conversations in good faith. As you know, that is the sermon series title, Can We Talk? Having Biblical Conversations in Good Faith. And so we're going to practice that using this book as our guide. And the good news is you don't have to have read the book in order to participate in the conversation. So that's tonight from 5:30 to 6:45. Pre-registration is required, but registration is still ongoing until 5:29. So that is happening tonight on Zoom. There'll be both large group and then a small group breakout session that'll be led by several folks, including Mary D. And so those are two important things that are happening today. And we are glad that we are able to come together across all these different ways in order to stay connected, even when we're still in our homes and it's not safe for us to be together. So I'm just glad to be able to spend time with one another. I'm happy that we're able to spend time with one another across all these different ways. So I'm going to hand it back over to Drake.
All righty. Well, Wilson, we are thankful for the staff and the job you were doing to keep the church engaged during these remote social distancing times. So thank you to both you and staff for the great job y'all are doing. So with that, Bruce, I'm going to turn it over to you for the 5th edition of the Covenant Class Zoom session. Thank you.
I think we're at the 4th edition, aren't we? I don't think we're quite at 5th yet.
4th or 5th?
We're 4th.
Yeah,
4th.
we're the 4th.
My bad.
Oh, no, that's all right.
Reset on that with the 4th edition.
I started to think, is this my last one? And
yeah, no.
So next week is last. Next week is 5th. So
and that was the 5th one. So my bad. The 4th.
Oh, that's all right.
Thank you.
Also, I tend to forget to pause for questions. So that doesn't mean I don't want you to type in your questions. in the Q&A feature, please do. And Mary D will let me know. Yeah, she'll say, Bruce, there's a question on line 2, you know, and then I will stop and answer it. So, or do my best to answer it. It's been a tumultuous week, and I thank all of you for being back with us today. So let's begin with a prayer if we can. Heavenly Father, thank you for this opportunity to come together through Zoom and through our hearts and our minds to look at these particular Bible verses that at first glance are troublesome, but help us in the long run to discern your intentions for our lives. Be in our hearts and minds, and be with all of those who are ill with COVID-19, our national leaders, and everyone who is suffering through this pandemic. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. All righty, I'm gonna bring up the PowerPoint again, if I may, because it helps me to keep things organized. There we go. We started out on September 13th with the story of Elisha calling on God to put a curse on the young boys, and God sent the bears down who ravaged 42 of the opponents. That was certainly a troublesome verse. The next week we skipped to the New Testament and talked about Jesus deciding in the middle of one of his encounters with the Canaanite woman that he was not going to ignore her and was not going to say that she was a dog at the table entitled only to the crumbs, but was going to give her the same blessing that he gave everyone. Also a troubling verse. Last week we moved on to Psalm 137, which starts out beautifully and ends very troublingly. But we were left with the message of how important it is to hang on to our harps and continue to sing the songs of Zion, even in the most troubling of times. Today we're moving on to a lesson that I call Tough Love, with the emphasis definitely on the love part. And we'll be discussing 6 different stories of fathers and sons. Specifically, I'm going to begin with the one that is listed third here, Deuteronomy 21, the guidance on what we should do with rebellious sons. But then to put that in context, we're going to go back to Genesis 1, when God breathes life into Adam and Eve, and then to another verse in Deuteronomy, the Shema, where God enters a paternal relationship with all of Israel. Then we're going to go further into Deuteronomy, looking at a story that is absolutely parallel, once again, with the Homeric story, this one being about the father-son team of Odysseus, or Ulysses if you're in the Roman, and his son Telemachus. And then we're moving back to the New Testament for the lesson of the father and the prodigal son. I'm calling it the lost son because I think that fits in with the theme of that particular passage in Luke. And then we're ending with one of my favorite Pauline letters, Paul's letter to the Colossians. So let's go ahead and start with today's lesson. a troubling verse if ever there was one. Deuteronomy 21:18 through 21. If someone has a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother and will not listen to them when they discipline him, his father and mother should take hold of him and bring him to the elders at the gate of his town. They shall say to the elders, "This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard." Then all the men of his town are to stone him to death. You must purge the evil from among you. All Israel will hear of it and be afraid. Well, this is certainly qualified to serve as one of the troubling verses. And I want to let you know why I picked this particular one. I'm going to go out of share for a minute. As many of you know, I had the privilege to write a play called Hugs and Kisses, which has been Virginia's principal child sexual abuse prevention program for the last 38 years. And because of this play, there have been 20,000 Virginia children who have disclosed their personal victimization, about 50% sexual abuse, about 50% physical abuse. But they've made the disclosures for the first time after seeing a performance of this play. So it is certainly one of the highlights of my career, and one that I'm particularly proud of. And early on, I used to attend several of the court cases that came about, because early on, the defense attorneys would use the script of Hugs and Kisses, and they'd say, "See, it was these elements of the script that made this child offer false testimony. And in fact, the alleged perpetrator, my client, didn't do anything wrong, but was misled by this play." Thankfully, that pretty much hasn't happened for the last 30 years, but in the first couple of years, it happened a fair amount. And I was at one physical abuse trial in Southwest Virginia. In fact, both of the trials I'm going to talk about were in Southwest Virginia. And the defense attorney, the perpetrator, the alleged perpetrator, was accused of basically beating his son senseless. And it was a terrible beating that no one could deny. But the defense attorney came forward and said, actually, this is a religious freedom issue, because, and he read the passage that we just read in court. And he said, now, I, as an attorney, I am not claiming that this passage gives us the right, but what I do want you to consider is that this father believed in the truth of this story, and in fact did not stone his son to death, but punished him in the way that he thought he was called on by the Bible to punish him. And then a year later, there was another case, and this time it was a sexual abuse case involving a young girl. And the defense attorney came in and read a passage from Judges, Judges 11. And I'm going to read that one to you today because it's in a similar vein as this one. This is about the judge named Jephthah, and he ruled over Israel as a judge for 6 years. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. He crossed Gilead and Manasseh passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from there he advanced against the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, if you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. Then Jephthah went over to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into his hands. When Jephthah returned to his home, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of tambourines? She was an only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. When he saw her, Jephthah tore his clothes and cried, "Oh, my daughter, you have made me miserable and wretched, because I have made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." "My father," she replied, "you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you promised, now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites. But grant me this one request," she said. "Give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends, because I will never marry." "You may go," Jephthah said. And he let her go for 2 months. She and the girls went into the hills and wept because she would never marry. After the 2 months, she returned to her father, and Jephthah did to her as he had vowed. And she was a virgin. From this comes the Israelite custom that each year the young women of Israel go out for 4 days to commemorate the daughter of Jephthah from Gilead. The first time I encountered this story was hearing it read in that courtroom, where it was being used as justification, and in this case it was an insanity plea, and said, this is the story that basically made my client sexually abuse his daughter because he thought that God had given him this power over her. And of course, it is heartbreaking, and we read these stories and we go, well, why even consider them? Why even read them? And the reason that I thought, well, I'm going to give a lesson on these two is because there are people that take these stories seriously. We all hear about it. It's easy to talk about Shia law that takes place an ocean apart from us, and in an Islamic country where particularly young women are terribly abused because Islamic fundamentalists believe that they have the God-given right to treat their daughters in this way. And in fact, they believe it is their responsibility to treat their daughters in this way. But we cannot, I have learned, discount that and say that that is something that happens in another culture far away. There are Christian fundamentalists in our own state who seriously abuse their children because of stories like this that they read in the Bible. And if you Google sermons on these stories, you'll come across a couple where people say, no, this makes sense because we have to discipline our children. And in fact, things have gone so far the other way now where we're not allowed to discipline our children. We need to go back to these Mosaic laws. In Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven, I think it's the next to last verse, he talks about this and about the Old Testament, about there being no balm in Gilead, because, not relating specifically to the story we just read, but that is the place where the story takes place. And Edgar Allan Poe says, "Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, Tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And then we have the wonderful song of Zion, the spiritual balm of Gilead, where they don't go back to the Old Testament, but they go to the New Testament, which is where we're about to go, and say, yes, there is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. I want to go now to another passage in, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead. I said we'd start with Adam and Eve, and that's what I want to do. Genesis 1:26 through chapter 2, verse 1. Then God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. This is the only time they use very on the sixth day. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. So that's the first parental story that the Bible gives us about when God breathes life into Adam and then into Eve. There's that beautiful painting that Michelangelo did on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, where you see God reaching out his hand. Michelangelo said there was a medieval hymn that he was basing this painting on, where it says, it is the finger on the right hand of God that reached out and gave to Adam the gift of life and the gift of speech. And this is purely an act of love. And on the sixth day is the only day that God looks down and sees that what he has created is very good. And he breathes life and gives life to Adam as a parent, a father and a mother give life to their children. And it's a very loving relationship. And when Adam and Eve disobey God and eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, God does not put them to death. He does cast them out of Eden, and then they live life under the terms that all of us do. Then we're going to God's paternal relationship with the nation of Israel. This is called the Shema. Shema is the first word, listen, sometimes translated as hear. And we are told that the word Shema in Hebrew doesn't mean listen, just hear it in your ears, but it means hear and obey. And the Shema is the most famous prayer in Jewish culture, and it's found in Deuteronomy. It goes like this. Listen, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord our God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. And in fact, in Jewish culture and tradition, this is the prayer the last prayer you say at the end of the day as you go to sleep, and it's the first prayer you say when you wake up in the morning. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them to your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. When the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers, be careful that you do not forget the Lord. Now we find out elsewhere in the Deuteronomistic history that people do forget the Lord, and in doing so bring about the Babylonian exile. But this part here, when they say, write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates, I love the fact that it is the Shema that is written inside every mezuzah that you see on the right-hand door frame as you enter a Jewish household. My good friends Sarah Bell and Neil November had the mezuzah on their apartment door at Westminster Canterbury, and every time we would go there, they would, as we would enter their apartment, they would touch it with the center finger of their right hand, kiss it, and then when they would leave, they would do the same thing as part of this blessing of the Shema. Now, the reason it sounds so familiar to us is because many of us just know it as a Shema, but also it appears in 3 of the Gospels as the greatest commandment. I'm going to read from Mark, although it is also in Matthew and Luke, this story. One of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked, of all the commandments, which is the most important? The most important one, answered Jesus, is this. Now, this is out of 613 commandments that are from Mosaic law and the Old Testament. 248 of them are do's and 365 of them are don'ts. And Jesus picks out the most important. The most important one, answered Jesus, is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God. The Lord is one. The Lord your God, or love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. One of the reasons I picked this one in Mark is because it adds a 4th with all your to the Shema from the Old Testament. And that is with all your mind. In the Old Testament Shema, they say with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, or with all your might. Jesus in Mark's adds, and with all your mind. And then without missing a beat, Jesus says, and the second one is this. And then he goes all the way back to Leviticus 19, I think it is. The second one is this, love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. Well, all of those commandments, all of those laws, which includes the one, if you have a rebellious son, take him to the elders of the city and put him to death. Certainly, that doesn't agree with this commandment that Jesus brings about. They call it the Christians Shema, and some of the things I was reading. But Jesus makes a point of letting us know that what is most important is to love our God with all of our heart and all of our soul and all of our mind. He's a good Presbyterian. And all of our strength, and also love your neighbor just as much as you love yourself. And of course, we've all heard the sermons, well, who is our neighbor? And our neighbor, basically, in this context, is everyone. Everyone we know, everyone we don't know, everyone who's from our neighborhood, everyone who is an alien who comes in from outside of our country. It's very prominent in Jewish teaching and in Christian teaching that we are to love all of those individuals, all of God's children, just as much as we love ourselves. Now, the fourth father-son story is a bit of a departure, but I like it. And this is also from Deuteronomy. It's just a couple verses away from the one that talks about the rebellious son. And this one is one of the do nots. And it says, do not plow with an ox and a donkey yoked together. And the reason that I decided to throw that one in today is because I have been talking about the Homeric epics that were written in about the same time that Deuteronomy was written, actually perhaps 100 years earlier than Deuteronomy was written. And as I encountered this one in Deuteronomy, do not plow with an ox and a donkey yoked together, I couldn't help but remember that that is one of the beginning stories in the legends of Odysseus or Ulysses. Odysseus was one of the suitors, you'll remember if you know this story, of Helen of Troy, and he was one of the unsuccessful suitors. He did not win her hand. And so he made a pledge, they all made a pledge, well, whoever does win her hand, you know, we will support him. So when Paris stole Helen of Troy away, all of the unsuccessful suitors had made a pledge to support the successful suitor. And so when war was begun with Troy over Helen, they went to all the unsuccessful suitors who were the best soldiers in Greece, and they said, well, you need to enlist and go fight with us against Troy. And Odysseus at that time was very happily married to Penelope, and he did not want to enlist. He was no longer felt compelled to defend Helen and her husband, who was the victor in that challenge of all the suitors. And so when he knew that the recruiters were coming to pay a call on him to get him to enlist and honor his pledge to support whoever actually won Helen's hand, he decided to feign insanity. He was like Klinger in MASH. Remember how Klinger always used to feign insanity? Klinger chose, his main tool was he chose to wear a dress, which I'm sure advocates for the trans community have a few things to say about that, being labeled insanity at this moment in time. But back when MASH was being aired, we all watched that and laughed. But just like Klinger was trying to avoid service during the Korean War by feigning insanity, Odysseus feigned insanity. And when the recruiters came, he said, well, here's what I'll do. I'll do the craziest thing I can think of. I will attach an ox and an ass to my plow, because everybody knows that you can't pull a plow with an ox and an ass because they go at different speeds, they go in different directions, they won't work in sync with each other. And they'll know I'm insane when I do that. So when I read in Deuteronomy 22, it says, do not plow with an ox and a donkey yoked together. You go, okay, well, that comes from the same place culturally that the Homeric epic comes from. But the recruiters didn't believe that Odysseus was crazy, and they wanted him to come fight in the Trojan War. And so they grabbed his infant son from Penelope, Telemachus. And you can see Telemachus right here in the painting. And they put Telemachus in front of the plow, this erratic plow that is being pulled by an ox and a donkey. It looks kind of like a stallion in this painting, but it's supposed to be a donkey. And Odysseus, of course, because he loved his son, stopped, immediately stopped. And therefore they knew that he was not crazy. You can see him pulling back on the plow here because he doesn't want to do any harm to his son, because Odysseus loved his son and wanted nothing but good to come to him. And that's how Odysseus wound up having to join the army, the Greek army, and fight in the Trojan War. So we're getting these different stories about fathers loving their sons in Genesis, and the pledge that God makes to all of his sons and daughters in Israel in the Shema, or the Shema, excuse me. And the story of Odysseus loving Telemachus. Well, then we get to the New Testament story in Luke 15 of the lost son, or the prodigal son. Jesus continued. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Give me my share of the estate." Well, we know this is a New Testament story now, because in the Old Testament, it's only the older son that would have inherited anything. But in this world of the New Testament, the laws have changed now, and the father is going to give an equal share to both of the sons. So the father divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had, and he set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. He was doing exactly what the son was accused of doing, debauchery and gluttony. After he had, there's a typo there, he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. And when the son came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am, starving to death." Now, we all know well the rest of the story of the prodigal son, that this lost son goes back to his father and begs him for forgiveness, and the father completely ignores the laws of Deuteronomy. And we are meant to know from Jesus telling this story that that's what the father is meant to do. And even though the son is completely guilty of disobedience, of drunkenness, of gluttony, the father runs out to meet him and throws his arms around him and gives him a ring and new clothes and a wonderful feast, to the point where the older son says, "Wait a minute, I'm the one who stays here and works with you and does everything according to the laws, and yet you're giving all the good stuff to my kid brother who's led such a disreputable life. He has been the model of the rebellious son. Shouldn't you be treating him the way Moses and Mosaic law would have?" And the father says to the elder son, "My son, you are always with me, and everything that I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. The New Testament message is completely erasing what the Old Testament law in Deuteronomy told us to do to the rebellious son. And that takes us to Paul's letter to the Colossians. Now, one of the reasons that I like this letter as much as I do is that it is one of the letters that all of the scholars tell us was actually written by Paul. Many of the Pauline letters, scholars will tell you today, weren't written by Paul. They were written by other people. And in Colossians, Paul even refers to the fact that other people are writing letters in his name. At the end of Colossians, Paul has been saying to his scribe what to write. And the scribe, because writing is an acquired skill still in this part of, in this time. And so most of Paul's letters are written by scribes. But at the end, Paul says, okay, now I'm going to write these last lines myself. And I'm going to write them very large, in very large script, so that you can tell that they're actually written by me in my rough hand. So Paul acknowledges that some of the letters that are signed Paul aren't really written by Paul, and scholars today tell us that many aren't, but Galatians actually is one of the ones. Also, it is one of the ones that is either Paul's very first letter or it's among his first. They're not quite sure whether it was written in 47 AD or whether it was written in the 50s. They can't figure out whether it was written just before the Council of Jerusalem or whether it was written just after the Council of Jerusalem. But if it's one of Paul's earliest letters, then it's also one of the very first books to be written in what we have as our New Testament, because all of the Gospels were written after Paul's letters. And Paul is not only writing earlier at a time closer to Jesus's life, but Paul also, as the author of this letter, actually is only one degree of separation from Jesus. Paul never knew Jesus personally, but Paul definitely knew Peter. Paul definitely knew James, the brother of Jesus. And so in many ways, this letter to the Galatians may be the earliest book in the New Testament written by someone who was very, very close to Jesus himself. And this says this: so also, when we were children, we were in slavery under the basic principles of the world. But when the time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under law, that we might receive the full rights of sons. Because you are sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son. And since you are a son, God has made you also an heir. Now, this word Abba is used in the New Testament 3 times. Jesus says it once in Gethsemane when he's praying to God and he says, please take this cup away from me. I know anything is possible in your hand, so please take this away from me. But if it has to happen, then your will be done. We're told that Abba is a very familiar, a very loving form of father. So it's almost like daddy. And that's the only time Jesus uses it. And then Paul uses it twice in his letters when he's trying to say that because of Jesus, through Jesus, we are now sons of God and heirs of God. Just like the 2 sons in the Prodigal Son parable, we are now entitled to our full share of God's love because all of that has been passed down to us through Jesus. So it's not just that Jesus was entitled to these things. Now those who believe in Jesus are also entitled to these things. So 3 times this word Abba is used in the New Testament, and it's meant to show this perfect, loving, intimate connection with God the Father. It is meant almost in defiance of, as Paul says, it is meant to redeem those who were under the law. So all of this stuff that we read in Deuteronomy about if your son is a rebellious son and whose son isn't, I'm blessed with a wonderful son and daughter, but there have been times when my son was completely rebellious. But Paul's saying Jesus has come to redeem all of the sons, all of the daughters. It's not gender specific. Also, the most famous part in Colossians is where Paul says it's no longer Jews and Greeks. It's no longer slaves and free men. It's no longer men and women. We're now all the same. In Paul's letter to Timothy, which isn't written by Paul, that's where it says women have to be silent. But in Paul's letter to the Colossians, it says we're all the same. Men and women, slaves and free men, Jews and Gentiles, all the same. And we are all children of God, and we do not fall into those old laws of Deuteronomy, but we fall into the new laws where we have permission, just like Jesus, to turn to God and say, Abba, Father, and to have as close a relationship as the one that God had at the very beginning with Adam on the painting in the Sistine Chapel, where he reaches out and the life from God goes into Adam, the first child, that starts the ball rolling for all of us. So next week, we are going to move on to my least favorite bumper sticker, and kind of the theme for this whole 5 lessons. God said it, I believe it, that's the end of it. And we're going to talk about how we are meant to use our minds in discerning these troubling verses of the Bible and figuring out what they mean to us today. Thank you for being here. I will see you next week.
Thanks everyone for joining, and Bruce, another wonderful class and a very appropriate message, challenging and polarizing times we're living in. Everyone, please remember to join the church service starting in about 10 minutes at 10 o'clock, and stay safe and healthy this week. And we look forward to seeing you with us back again next Sunday, same time and same Zoom link. Take care.